lieber Herr Dr. Eberhard. Vielen Dank, dass Sie heute für eine weitere...
Greetings, Dr. Eberhard. Thank you very much for joining another episode of Thanatology Up-to-Date. Today we would like to talk about near-death experiences and compare them to different cultures, to see to what extent such experiences are purely subjective or whether people around the world have similar experiences. First, I would like to pose a more summarized question. According to your view, what are the most important recurring features of near-death experiences in North American and European culture, or in other words, in the modern Western world that we are familiar with?
These features have actually been the same for almost 50 years now. Raymond Moody, who first described, summarized and categorized these features almost 50 years ago in 1975, has cast them in steel, so to speak. They have actually remained the same. These features start with a trigger such as an accident, a clinical death, an illness, a heart attack, or a cardiac arrest. And then these features practically never occur in their entirety. What I mean is, they are often a selection of this list of features. Raymond Moody has described near-death experiences that they often start with a sound, a noise. Next there comes the perception, now I'm dead, and apparently this is also partly combined with an out-of-body experience. The person is outside of his or her body and can see himself or herself. And the next feature would be a tunnel. The tunnel leads into another world, but it can also lead into the out-of-body experience. It varies. After going through this tunnel, people often have this classic light experience, which is a very bright but not a blinding light. They meet deceased people. They may meet beings that are very bright and loving. It's an overall love and sometimes omniscience. And there is also this panorama of life, which has become very well known too. It is a retrospection, like witnessing one's life in sections and feeling these sections. And then they experience this border situation where they have to decide whether to stay or return, or they may not have a choice at all. They are sent back and re-enter their body. And then there is the whole aftermath, which is almost a subject in itself. So this would have been a rough outline of these experiences in a Western context.
If we look at Eastern cultures, how do near-death experiences in Japan, for example, differ from typical experiences in the West?
This was actually a central question quite early on. Is what we are examining here in the West a cultural asset, or does it have global elements too? Perhaps today it makes sense to draw a comparison between modern, very complex societies in various countries. And perhaps Japan, which you mentioned earlier, would be a good example. Japan has been studied in more detail than other Asian countries. There are 5 studies which are conducted more than 10 years apart from each other. They are relatively small and have not been done in a highly professional manner. However, it is enough to give an insight. When we think of Moody's features or model-like structures of a near-death experience and compare them to Japanese culture, it is interesting to look at the differences. In Japan, the features that are completely missing are the tunnel and the life review. In all these studies, there was only one life review and never a tunnel experience. Another difference is the experience of the light. The light does occur, but it is often more impersonal. They don't necessarily meet deceased people they know. They don't meet Jesus or God or angels either. It's just a source of light which is impersonal. So there is no communication with the light. The light does not speak to them. And perhaps this is the connection why there is no life review. There is less interaction in Japanese near-death experiences. And the Japanese also experience this image of a meadow of flowers, which is a classic element of the idea of a Japanese afterlife. Most of them find themselves on a meadow of flowers. Others are surrounded by white light in this Spartan Japanese context, namely a white, bright, shining light, but with no frippery around it. Or they see a sky. One person experienced the blue sky.
If we look to another Eastern culture, China, what are the features there?
One thing that is extraordinary is that in China, a study was carried out just 1 year after Moody's Life After Life was published. It was a study on near-death experiences during a disaster that was very relevant at the time, namely the Tangshan earthquake, which took place in 1976. They interviewed 80 earthquake victims who had been seriously injured and buried alive. They were selected and interviewed, and 30 of them had a near-death experience. It was interesting that, in contrary to expectations, in China these features of near-death experiences were extremely similar, especially in comparison to the ones in Japan. All the elements I mentioned earlier were present. There seemed to be little difference between the people in the Chinese study, and this was apparently also confirmed by later studies that were not related to this earthquake. So in this context, it seems that Chinese culture, or at least whoever is from a Chinese culture and has a near-death experience, is relatively similar to our Western culture.
Are there significant differences in other Asian cultures, such as Thailand?
Yes, Thailand is one of the countries where we can find a few cases that have been described. Perhaps the most relevant difference to our Western culture is that Buddhist elements are shown in Japanese, Chinese, and Southeast Asian influences. This is mainly due to the god of the dead, Yama, who is a god of the dead in Buddhism that also appears in Hinduism. He plays an important role there because he is responsible for death. Yama is a figure somewhere in between being a judge and a god of the dead. But he is actually well-meaning in principle, but also strict in his way. Because he is a judge, plays a very decisive role for everyone who dies, and thus actually occurs in such situations. Another thing that I only know from a case in Thailand is that a person who had a near-death experience, and here I've got to say that life reviews practically don't occur either. But instead of a life panorama, this person experienced an intense life situation that was exemplary for his life. So this case was representative for a very complex life review. There is a Japanese film, I don't know the name of it, but this case reminds me of it. It is a film by a Japanese director. In the film, when you die, you are given the choice. You had this and that life. Now, you can choose one moment in your life which stays with you. You can remember this moment, but everything else will be erased. I don't think it was that dramatic from the Thai person. For him, it was the exemplary representation of his life of this certain event.
Let's now take a leap to India. What are the reports like in this cultural group?
One bridge would be Yama. In Hinduist India, Buddhism actually developed from Hinduism, or at least it developed in Hindu territory in India. This is what the two cultures share. And we also encounter Yama again, but then also other aspects of it. One thing is clear, we know of relatively early studies conducted in India. Randy Haraldson and Carly Sosi interviewed about 800 people in the health service sector in 1977, only 2 years after the publication of Life After Life. Near-death experiences weren't the only outcome of this study. There were also after-death contacts in some cases, or deathbed visions. But it gave a certain first insight into near-death experiences as they are experienced in India. And there is also the encounter with Yama. However, experiences of tunnels and life reviews are less common. Instead of a life review, in India, people experience quite often a reading of the Book of Life. A kind of authoritative otherworldly person makes a conclusion and knows everything. It is written in this book, as we know from our culture in early times, such as Santa Claus, St. Nicholas, who got this book that contains everything. It's not quite as popular today anymore, but it plays a big role in India, and it is still being lived. And there is also a near-death experience of a Western European person who converted and became a disciple of Sai Baba, an Indian guru. He had a near-death experience and experienced the same things that are common in Indian near-death experiences. I couldn't really say it, but obviously it's probably also anchored in a cultural context that when you die, it's part of the afterlife, the judgment that is read out of the Book of Life. A very interesting aspect seen in a Western European context that we just know from the not-so-recent Middle Ages is the mix-up. So you arrive over there and then you look at the book and you're told, "Oh, I'm sorry, you're the wrong one. You might have the same name or you might live in the same village, but we wanted someone else. You have to go back." That sounds quite bizarre to us, but we also know this example from the Middle Ages, where we can find two cases like that. Even in the Middle Ages, this was partly interpreted as a warning, meaning that God hadn't made a mistake and that it actually wasn't a mix-up. They didn't think God could make mistakes. This is the same case in India, where they don't think the gods could make such a mistake. But in any case, that's the reason given why the person can't stay and has to go back.
A question that has been asked again and again in the comments section of Thanatos TV is, do near-death experiences also exist in the Islamic world? And what do they look like? Do we know anything about them?
Yes, we know of individual cases and a few studies. The Shiite area in Iran is the best researched. There are a few cases and studies that have been done in Iran, and they are very similar to China. What could perhaps distinguish it somewhat from China, for example, is the importance of the Quran in Islam. In one near-death experience, the daughter sees her father, and this father was always very pious in a positive sense. For him, the Quran was a very important book. And then she meets him, and he is very happy and reads his Quran. What struck me, I don't know what the reason is, but there are negative near-death experiences, which in relation to the high number of near-death experiences that we know of in Western cultures, where negative near-death experiences occur relatively rarely, there are two cases amongst Islamic near-death experiences where the people had a kind of hell-like experience. Of course, it has to be said that hell as a fear, as an otherworldly reality, is certainly even more important in Islam than in Christianity, where its importance has faded over the years.
What is your conclusion? Wouldn't we have to say that religious imprinting does play an important role in the nature of near-death experiences?
We could simplify it by saying that the features are actually the same, although there are differences in terms of frequency and quantity. So just subsequently, for example, the Japanese also experience a border, but this border is very often a river. We also find this river in borders that are experienced by Europeans, but there it is very rare. If you count them, perhaps every 70th border experience is a river. We have similar elements, but they are often interpreted differently. But then we also have to say, there is this variability between individuals, which is, for example, also quite severe in a Western context. This is perhaps almost comparable to genetics. They were astonished when they were able to analyze the genes of us and realize that we as humans aren't that different from each other in a global sense, that an African person and a Thai person are about as similar as you are to me. If we broke down our two genes to one person, they would be more different than the genes of Europeans compared to the genes of Africans. This inter-individual difference, and this is very important to know, is probably greater in near-death experiences than the difference in common or combined near-death experiences between Europe and India. So we have a high degree of individual variance, but at the same time, to some extent, also an intercultural variance. It is clear that the imprint of culture, personality and expectations have an influence on what we experience. There, the type of subjective expectation or subjective imagination becomes objective reality. It's also interesting that people who had a near-death experience keep describing their experiences as hyperreal. By the way, this is an element where we don't find any differences between individuals. It's highly objective for those who experience it. They wouldn't doubt it either. In only a few cases, they doubt that it was a real experience at all. It is perceived as objective, but from our point of view, there is a lot of subjectivity in it, or at least there is a cultural aspect in every near-death experience.
Near-death experiences are often interpreted as evidence that life continues after death. A key argument is that everyone experiences the same thing, regardless of culture. But there are obviously relevant cultural differences. What is your conclusion? Do they weaken the survival hypothesis?
I think you can draw neither one nor the other conclusion from this. Let's assume that all near-death experiences were really more or less the same. Then one could say that clearly speaks for the fact that this is somehow genetically fixed. But one could also say, no, this is a basic experience that takes place in the hereafter. The reverse is also true. So, if there is such variability, then one could say, yes, we have the variability, we also have the basic structure that is always there. Then it could also be, so to speak, just a basic genetic plan, which then determines it. But the rest is then varied. So, that could be the case too. Or even if we say, no, near-death experiences are psychological aspects anyway, we could say, of course, there must be differences between individuals. But then we suddenly have a problem, because why are there always so many of the same features? And not only from those who know about near-death experiences, but also from people who lived during times when we knew nothing about them at all. We always come to the point where we actually have to say, purely on the basis of experience, we cannot draw any conclusions. Is it genetic? Is it psychological? Is it really otherworldly?
So, if it is a real otherworldly experience, then it should not be surprising that this experience is also individually colored. After all, we also experience the physical world individually.
Yes, that's right.
Dr. Eberhard, thank you very much for this valuable summary. Thank you very much for the interview.